A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi, Herman and Corin. So the world of agentic AI has been moving really quickly over the past couple of years and has been slowly coming out of obscurity or making its way into the mainstream. If you asked me to categorize the world of agentic AI a year ago, I would say that there is a huge amount of fracturing and it's still a very developer-centric tooling. There was much more thought being put into the frameworks, and it was never very little thought, if any at all, was being given to how do we actually make these maintainable and usable for non-developers. We saw the big AI labs coming out with their agentic SDKs. We saw great tools for back-end orchestration. But if you asked, okay, all this stuff looks great, but if I want to actually maintain my agents, do I need to go into an IDE and manually edit the code in Python? And the answer is often yes. And that really limited the possibility that they could actually not only be maintained and used by business users, but even I think for developers, just such a lot of effort required to define each agent. And my criticism of code-centric approaches is always that if you need something that's going to change and adapt to your business conditions, having something tied to a repository on someone's computer or in a specific cloud environment is a cumbersome way. It's not very agile. It's not a good way to move quickly. So we've seen belatedly some tooling beginning to emerge that actually allows people, including in open source projects, to create agents with system prompts, with tooling, with skills, and actually have a web UI to operate them. I'd love to talk about one of the questions about agentic AI that I think is still unresolved for me. One of the things I noticed when using ChatGPTs, custom GPTs, the predecessor to proper agentic tooling we have today, is I'd find that I'd create a few agents that were really helpful. For example, one of my first ones was creating a meeting agenda from a voice note. So I would say, I'm having this meeting on this date. I want to talk about this. And you're going to take this information and provide an agenda. And you're going to save it in a Google Drive folder. And you're going to send it to the meeting participants. So even though that might seem like a simple configuration, it's involving a system prompt. It's involving access to multiple tools and a useful workflow. Now, I might have maybe 10 different tools that throughout the course of a business week, I'd say these are my go-tos. And the challenge was really finding the joined up UI. And often when I would try to describe how this works to those who hadn't experimented with agentic AI before, their very legitimate criticism was, that sounds great, but surely there's some way to can you get the agents to talk to one another and work with one another? And that brings us to the idea of multi-agent orchestration and how that can actually work. I think the backbone of agents, I continue to think, is not the memory layer so much as the context layer. And I'm a big advocate for deliberately gathering context, providing it to agents, and then having them do their best work. Yes, you can update the context pool from memory, but if you start from a blank slate, it's very hard to get anything like decent results out of the box. And you can often lose traction and interest if at the first hurdle it looks like kind of a buggy or not so useful system, and you'll face the what does this do differently than ChatGPT objection. So what I'd love to talk about today, Herman and Corin, sorry for the background noise, is for those, if you're looking to deploy a multi-agent setup in a business, for a business, and you want something that is going to have configurations that you can maintain, you may not want to go down the SaaS route because often that's extremely expensive. you're tech savvy enough to be able to spin up a EC2 instance or a DigitalOcean droplet in order to host something, but you need to create a maintainable system for your business. And that's going to be logical for end users. They're going to have a single point to log into. They're going to be able to use these agents, tune the configurations as needed, and have them work together. And a way to run workflows, and maybe a way to chat to agents, because we often see this division between workflow based agentic AI tooling and approaches, chat interfaces, and often I think developers forget that the same configuration can have value in both directions. You might want to run it as a workflow sometimes or on a schedule, and sometimes you might want to manually engage a workflow through beginning with the chat conversation. So I think both of those approaches are really important. So I'd love to get your thoughts, Herman and Corin, on where you think this tooling is at the moment, and if you were to recommend specific projects for someone looking to deploy the type of environment I described, what are some tools that you might recommend across open source, software as a service, and any other deployment method that we commonly see used?
Hey everyone, welcome back to my weird prompts. We have got a really substantive one today. I was just sitting out on the balcony looking over at the old city, thinking about how much has changed in the world of technology in just the last year or two. Our housemate Daniel sent us an audio prompt this morning that really highlights that shift. He is asking about the state of agentic artificial intelligence tooling. Specifically, how we move from those early, fractured, developer-heavy frameworks into something a business can actually maintain without spending a fortune on subscription services.
Herman Poppleberry here, and let me tell you, Daniel is hitting on the exact nerve that the industry is feeling right now. It is that transition from the hobbyist phase to the infrastructure phase. Remember back in 2024 when everyone was excited about AutoGPT and baby AGI? Those were basically just scripts that would run in a loop until they hit an error or burned through your entire credit limit. They were fascinating, but they were a nightmare to manage. Now, in early 2026, we are finally seeing the emergence of what I like to call the operating system for agents.
That is a great way to frame it. It feels like we're moving from the command line era of agents into the graphical user interface era. But Daniel's point about maintainability is the real kicker. It is one thing to build a cool demo. It is another thing to have a multi-agent system that your operations team can actually monitor and update without needing a computer science degree. Herman, you've been diving deep into some of these open source projects lately. Where do you see the biggest leap forward?
The biggest leap is definitely the unification of the workflow and the chat interface. For a long time, you had two separate worlds. You had things like Flowies or Langflow, which were very visual and great for building complex logic chains, but they felt like developer tools. Then you had things like custom GPTs or various chat interfaces, which were easy to use but lacked the deep logic and the ability to branch out into complex business processes. The project that I think is really winning this space right now, and one I know Daniel would appreciate, is Dify. That is spelled D-I-F-Y. It is an open source platform that essentially acts as an LLM application development platform. It allows you to build these agentic workflows using a visual interface, but it also gives you a unified chat front end that you can deploy to your team or your customers.
I have seen you playing around with Dify in the living room. One thing that struck me was how it handles the orchestration of different agents. Daniel mentioned the challenge of getting agents to talk to each other. In the old days, you had to manually code the handoffs. You had to say, okay, if agent A produces this specific string of text, then trigger agent B. It was incredibly brittle. How does a platform like Dify or some of the newer orchestration frameworks handle that now?
It is much more elegant now because we have moved toward a more intentional design. Instead of just letting agents wander around and hope they find the right answer, we are using what we call agentic design patterns. In Dify, for example, you can set up a manager node or a router. The router uses a high reasoning model like GPT-5 or one of the newer Claude models to analyze the incoming request and decide which specialized agent is best equipped to handle it. But the real secret sauce is the shared context and the standardized tool calling. We talked about this a bit back in episode 795 when we discussed sub-agent delegation. The idea is that instead of one giant, confused agent, you have a fleet of specialists who all speak the same language and have access to a shared memory layer.
That memory layer seems crucial for maintainability. If I am a business owner, I do not want to have to retrain or reconfigure 10 different agents every time my company policy changes. I want a central place where that knowledge lives. Does the current tooling allow for that kind of centralized knowledge base that all agents can pull from?
This is where the integration of RAG, or Retrieval Augmented Generation, into the agentic workflow has become seamless. In a platform like Dify, or even some of the newer enterprise versions of CrewAI, you can upload your business documents, your standard operating procedures, and your technical manuals into a central knowledge base. You do not have to give that data to every single agent. Instead, you create a search tool that all your agents are allowed to use. So, if your billing agent needs to know the refund policy, it does not need to have that policy in its head, it just knows how to ask the knowledge-based tool for that specific information. This makes the system much more maintainable because when the policy changes, you just update the document in one place and every agent in your ecosystem instantly has access to the new information.
That definitely addresses the maintainability side. But what about the cost and the reliance on SaaS? Daniel mentioned wanting to avoid expensive subscriptions. We have talked before about the death of SaaS in episode 864, and it feels like we are reaching a tipping point where self-hosting these agentic platforms is actually viable for a mid-sized business. What does the infrastructure look like for someone who wants to run this themselves?
It has never been easier, honestly. Most of these top-tier open source tools, like Dify, Flowies, or even things like OpenWeb UI, are designed to be run as Docker containers. If you have a decent server or even just a robust cloud instance like an EC2 or a DigitalOcean droplet, you can spin these up in minutes. But the real game changer for cost control is the emergence of AI gateways. We did a whole deep dive on this in episode 841 when we talked about LiteLLM. For a business, you do not want to hard code your agents to a specific provider like OpenAI or Anthropic. You use something like LiteLLM as a gateway. It provides a single, unified API that looks like OpenAI's API, but behind the scenes it can route requests to whatever model is cheapest or most effective at that moment. You can even route some tasks to local models running on your own hardware using Ollama or VLLM.
So, you were saying a business could use a high-end model for the complex orchestration, the thinking and the routing, but then use a much smaller, cheaper, or even self-hosted model for the basic data extraction or summary tasks. That would drastically bring down the operating costs of a multi-agent system.
And that is where the unified interface becomes so powerful. In a tool like Dify, you can specify different models for different nodes in your workflow. You might use Claude 4 for the initial reasoning because its logic is so sharp, but then pass the actual drafting of an email to a smaller Llama model that you are running locally. This kind of hybrid approach is how you build a professional-grade system without getting bled dry by per token costs from the big providers. Plus, from a security and sovereignty perspective, keeping your data within your own VPC or on your own hardware here in Jerusalem is a huge win.
Let's talk about the user experience for a second. Daniel mentioned the divide between workflow-based approaches and chat-based approaches. As a business user, I sometimes want a deterministic workflow where I know exactly what steps are being taken, like an automated payroll check. But other times, I just want to chat with an agent to brainstorm a marketing campaign. How do these new tools bridge that gap? Can one agent do both?
That is one of the coolest developments in the last few months. The best tools now allow you to expose your workflows as chat-enabled agents. Think of it like this. A workflow is a set of instructions, a map. A chat-based agent is the person walking that map. In these modern platforms, you can build a very complex, rigid workflow for, say, processing an insurance claim. But then you give that workflow a chat interface. The user can talk to the agent, and the agent uses the workflow to make sure it follows all the necessary steps, asks the right questions, and gathers the required data. It feels like a conversation to the user, but behind the scenes, it is a highly structured process. This prevents the agent from hallucinating or going off the rails, which was the biggest problem with the early chat-only agents.
It sounds like we are finally getting the best of both worlds. The flexibility of natural language and the reliability of structured code. I'm curious, though, about the learning curve. If Daniel or one of our listeners wants to set this up tomorrow, how much technical heavy lifting are we talking about? Is this still something where you need to be a senior developer, or have we reached the low-code stage yet?
We are firmly in the low-code stage, though I would say you still need some technical literacy. You need to understand how APIs work, what a system prompt is, and how to manage a basic server environment. But you are not writing thousands of lines of Python code anymore. You are mostly connecting blocks in a visual interface and writing clear, concise instructions in plain English. The real skill has shifted from coding to orchestration and prompt engineering. You need to be able to think logically about how a task should be broken down. If you can draw a flowchart of a business process, you can build an agentic workflow in 2026.
That is an encouraging thought. It democratizes the power of these tools. I want to circle back to the multi-agent orchestration piece, because I think that is where most people get stuck. There is this idea of the manager-agent pattern that I find fascinating. Instead of the user managing 5 different agents, the user talks to one manager, and that manager delegates. How does that look in practice within these tools?
It looks like a nested hierarchy. In a framework like CrewAI, which is very popular right now for this specific reason, you define a crew. You have a researcher, a writer, and a manager. The manager is an agent whose only job is to look at the task, decide which of the other agents should handle it, and then review their work before passing it back to the user. In a visual tool like Dify, you can replicate this by having a routing node that acts as the manager. What is really interesting is that these manager agents are getting much better at handling edge cases. If the researcher agent comes back with no results, the manager agent can now say, "Wait, that doesn't seem right. Try searching this other database instead." It is that iterative, self-correcting behavior that makes it truly agentic.
And I imagine that also helps with the context window issues we used to have. If you try to cram everything into one conversation, the model eventually gets confused and starts forgetting things from the beginning of the chat. By breaking it into sub-agents, you are essentially giving each task its own fresh context window, right?
Spot on, Corn. That is a huge part of the maintainability and the reliability. Each subagent only gets the information it needs for its specific task. The researcher doesn't need to know the user's billing history, it just needs the search query. The writer doesn't need to see the raw search results, it just needs the summarized notes from the researcher. This keeps the prompts short and focused, which reduces hallucinations and keeps the cost down. It is much more efficient than trying to have one giant brain do everything at once.
So, if we were to give Daniel a concrete recommendation list, what are the top 3 projects he should look at if he wants to build a maintainable, unified, multi-agent setup for a business today?
Number 1 is definitely Dify. It is the most complete package right now. It has the visual workflow builder, the knowledge base management, the multi-model support, and a really slick chat interface that you can just hand over to non-technical users. It is open source, you can host it yourself, and it is very robust. Number 2, I would say look at CrewAI, especially if you have someone on the team who is comfortable with a little bit of Python. Their enterprise features and their focus on structured agent roles are top-notch. And number 3, for the infrastructure layer, you have to use LiteLLM. It is the only way to stay provider agnostic and keep your costs under control as you scale.
That is a solid list. I would also add that people shouldn't sleep on OpenWeb UI if they just want a very clean, familiar interface for their team to interact with various models and agents. It is not as deep on the workflow side as Dify, but for a simple chat-based agent setup that connects to your local or cloud models, it is incredibly easy to maintain.
Good point. It is all about choosing the right tool for the complexity of the task. If you are just doing simple Q&A, Dify might be overkill. But if you are trying to automate a 3-step business process with multiple agents, that is where the power of a real orchestration platform shines. One thing I want to mention, though, that often gets overlooked is the importance of observability. When you have 5 agents talking to each other, things will eventually go wrong. You need to be able to see exactly what Agent A said to Agent B.
Right, the black box problem. If the final output is wrong, you need to know which link in the chain broke. Do these tools provide that kind of debugging or tracing?
They do. This is another area where the tooling has matured. Dify has built-in tracing where you can see the full execution log of every node in a workflow. For more advanced setups, people are using tools like Lang-Smith or Phoenix. These are essentially like the Chrome developer tools but for AAI. You can see the exact prompt that went to the model, the exact response, how many tokens were used, and how long it took. For a business, this is non-negotiable. You can't have a mission-critical process running on a system that you can't audit or debug.
It is amazing to see how quickly the ecosystem is building out the boring but necessary parts of the stack. The monitoring, the logging, the cost management. It makes it feel like AI is finally growing up. It is not just a parlor trick anymore. It is becoming real infrastructure.
It really is. And for us here in Jerusalem, where we have such a vibrant tech scene, we are seeing this happen in real time. There are so many startups focusing just on the evaluation and the safety of these agentic workflows. It is a great time to be building. I think Daniel is in a perfect position to start deploying this. My advice to him would be to start small. Don't try to build a 10-agent crew on day one. Build one solid workflow that solves a single annoying problem and then build from there.
That is always the best advice. Solve a real problem first. One thing that occurs to me is the geopolitics of this. By using open source tools and self-hosting, businesses are insulating themselves from some of the volatility of the big tech giants. If a specific provider changes its terms of service or gets caught up in a regulatory battle, a business using Dify and LiteLLM can just point their API key somewhere else and keep running. That kind of resilience is very much in line with the worldview we often talk about on this show. American innovation is driving a lot of this, but the open source movement is ensuring that the power is distributed and not just concentrated in a few boardrooms in Silicon Valley.
It is about sovereignty. Digital sovereignty for businesses and individuals. When you host your own agentic platform, you own your logic, you own your data, and you own your workflows. No one can turn you off or double your prices overnight without you having a choice. That is a very conservative, pro-business approach to technology. It is about building on solid ground rather than renting space on a shifting sand dune.
Well said, Herman. I think we have given Daniel a lot to chew on. This whole area of agentic AAI is moving so fast that I am sure we will be revisiting it in another 50 episodes or so. But for now, the path seems clear. Move toward unified, open source platforms that give you visibility and control.
And don't be afraid to experiment. The cost of failure is so low right now because the tools are so accessible. You can spin up a Docker container, try out a workflow, and if it doesn't work, you just delete it and try again. It is a playground for productivity.
I love that. A playground for productivity. Well, I think that is a good place to wrap up our core discussion for today. Before we go, I want to remind everyone that if you are finding these deep dives helpful, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a quick review on Spotify or whatever podcast app you are using. It genuinely helps other people find the show and keeps us motivated to keep digging into these weird prompts that Daniel sends our way.
Yeah, it really does make a difference. And if you want to reach out or see our full archive of over 900 episodes, head over to our website at myweirdprompts.com. You can find our RSS feed there and a contact form if you have a topic you want us to tackle. We have covered everything from battery chemistry to the future of the Middle East, so there is plenty to explore.
Definitely. We actually mentioned a few related episodes today, like episode 7095 on subagent delegation and episode 841 on AI gateways. If you are serious about building what we talked about today, those are great companion listens. You can search for them right on the website.
All right, I think that is it for this one. Thanks for the prompt, Daniel, even if you are just in the other room probably already tinkering with some of these tools.
He probably is. All right, everyone, thanks for listening to my weird prompts. We will be back soon with another deep dive. Until then, stay curious and keep building.
See you next time.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts.